Stop. And we are rolling.
All right, hello everybody, good morning. Sorry for the technical difficulties. My name is Adam Vincent, and this is Securing the Secure Shell the Automated Way. Who am I? Primarily, I am a data scientist in my day job. I do a lot of automation, have what I would consider big data, and there's definitely bigger out there, but a lot of stuff, and the only way we can process this is through huge amounts of automation. I'm a security enthusiast. Am I an expert? Not by any stretch of the imagination, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn last night. I'm also a cryptography fan, and that's why I'm here speaking to you today. So I want to talk to you a couple of things today. First, I want to talk a little bit about SSH itself. Then I want to talk about our configuration that we're going to use with OpenSSH. I want to talk a little bit about key files because those are extremely important. Then we're actually going to look at the configuration for the OpenSSH server. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about Ansible. First up, History of the World, Part 1. This gentleman here is Tatu Ilonen. And back in 1995, he was a researcher at the Helsinki University of Technology, and they suffered a pretty bad password sniffing attack. They had all of their usernames, passwords, data, the whole kit and caboodle going across their network backbone in clear text. So Tatu did not want his research stolen and said, hey, there's got to be a better way to do this. He started looking through a bunch of cryptography books, read through the PGP source code, and said, hey, I can do this. And in a couple months later, July of 1995, he released the very first version of SSH. So, open source, it was extremely popular, and in November of 1995, he released an internet draft to the Internet Engineering Task Force that actually detailed how his protocol worked. So being, again, open source and extremely popular, because hey, who doesn't want to have their stuff encrypted across the network, got a lot of support requests for this brand new technology he created. And he said, hey, I can help you with that. And a lot of them also came with $signs attached. So he said, I can absolutely help you with that. He created the SSH Communication Security Corporation, which even today is a leading researcher in SSH. They also have their own version of SSH client and server. Has a lot of really cool stuff. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So when you have all of these new eyes on the source code, you have Linus's law play out, and you find bugs because they become shallow very, very quickly. So as people discovered more and more stuff, there were a lot of flaws that were in the source code itself, obviously, but they also found a few flaws in the actual cryptography. And to fix them, you would have to completely break backward compatibility with all current installs. So what do you do when that happens? Version 2. And in 1996, SSH Communication Security Corporation released SSH version 2. So the IETF had been monitoring this for a while and said, this is extremely important, this new technology here to encrypt things across the wire. So what we need to do is actually formalize this as a standard. So they formed the SecSH Working Group. And in October of 1997, that working group released the first draft. And you can find it at that link there. And we'll fast forward a little bit. January 2006, it became RFC 4251. Detailing SSH2 protocol. And you can find that at that link there. So, shamelessly stole this off of Wikipedia. There are a lot of flavors of SSH. The IETF created the standard, and because it's a standard, all sorts of people can implement it. There are a whole huge number of variety of licenses, pretty much everything from standard open source stuff to commercial versions, and they have a huge amount of different configuration options in between them. Again, since I shamelessly stole this from Wikipedia, they also said that OpenSSH is currently the widest available, the most deployed across everything. So that is what we're going to talk about today. All right. OpenSSH is actually a suite of utilities. It's not just one. To start with, it's the SSH, which is our client. There's also SSHD, which you probably have guessed is the daemon. There's the SSH Key Gen utility, which lets us create strong cryptographic keys. The SSH Agent, which is an in-memory key store, and we're going to talk a good bit about that here in a few minutes. There's SSH Add, which is a manager for SSH Agent. SCP, the Secure Copy Program. SFTP, which is the SSH File Transfer Protocol. The SFTP Server, obviously the server for the SSH File Transfer Protocol. SSH Key Scan and SSH Key Sign, which are used for host-based authentication, and we're not going to talk much about that. The first 5 are what we are going to mostly focus on. Okay, so SSH itself has a few main areas of responsibility. The primary goal was encryption across the wire, and it does this pretty much transparently to the user. It works very, very well. Second part it wants to do is message validation, and that makes sure that the encrypted bits you send across the wire are the ones that are both being received and sent. And lastly, we have user authentication. So do we actually establish the SSH connection in the first place? How do we determine if the user is allowed onto the system? So there's a new standard in cryptography, the elliptical curve, and specifically ED 25519, made by this guy, Daniel J. Bernstein. He had done a bunch of research, and the actual math for this is extremely complicated and over my head, to be perfectly honest with you. There's a lot of extremely fancy graph math involved with creating this. It works on a different set of the discrete logarithm problem. So instead of using extremely large prime numbers, we use extremely fancy graph math. Again, I'm not going to try to explain that because it's extremely complicated. If you want to learn more, check out the blog there, and you can find a lot more about that. The important thing is that we can use this without having to know all the technical details. Thank you, technology. And what we're going to do is create some private keys, public-private key pairs specifically, using this ED 25519 algorithm. So this was actually added in OpenSSH version 6.5, which was released back in January of 2014. So you at least need that version or newer to be able to use this particular functionality. So if we're going to go generate keys, what are we going to use? SSH Key Gen. So very simple command line interface to create these keys. The -T option gives you, there's actually a huge number of things it allows, but we're going to specifically use the ED 25519. And we're also going to use the -A flag. And the -A flag is a really interesting option. So it doesn't actually add security to the key itself. What it does is prevent or help prevent brute force attacks against the key. What it will do is iterate over the value that you put in as the password a number of times. So it imposes a cost because it'll hash the password first and then hash that value and then hash that value and on and on and on until that number of times. So anyone who wants to get into and try to crack the key has to hash that many times. It's a bit of a soft cost. You know, technology is always improving. We're never going to have less processing power than we do right now, but it makes it harder for people to brute force into the keys. As a bit of a benchmark for that, using a 1,000 round iteration, I've got a couple of generations old Core i7 in my desktop at home, and it will do that in about 7 seconds. And yeah, that means every single time that I use the key, it costs me 7 seconds. But that also means that anyone who wants to brute force that has to spend 7 seconds per guess, give or take a little bit for processing power and whatnot. So it dramatically dramatically increases the amount of time it takes for brute force attacks. So this is the standard output for SSH Key Gen. By default, it saves it in the .ssh/id_ed 25519 both the private key gets saved there and the public key gets saved as that.pub. Choose a strong password for this. It's extremely, extremely important to choose a strong password. Again, according to Wikipedia, if you want a really good secure password, you want at least 20 random ASCII characters. And when I say random, I don't mean your dog's name and your wife's maiden name and your birthday. Truly randomly generated 20 characters. And what that will do is create bits of entropy that we need to use for security. So, the ED25519 standard is considered to have 128 bits of security. And what that means, we'll talk about in just a couple minutes. But okay, let's see. So again, I said OpenSSH 6.5 was the first version that the elliptic curve stuff was implemented. There are a lot of older clients running around in the wild, and sometimes you simply don't have an option but to use some of the older stuff. So if you need to use older things, you can still generate RSA keys, and I would recommend at least a 4096-bit key. These, again, are different bits. These are like actual bits on the hard drive length as opposed to the bits of entropy, which, again, we're going to talk about here in just a minute. Also, another fun little option, -O. There's a new key format that OpenSSH uses. It uses it specifically with the elliptic curve, and again, I believe it was OpenSSH 6.5 that implemented that as well. That will save these as a SHA-256 version, so that way it's even harder to actually crack and break into these. So by default, if you want it on the older algorithms, you have to tell it, hey, go ahead and use this new thing. So, okay. I want to diverge for a minute into a little bit of crazy cryptography. Anybody spend any time in the Lockport room across the hall? Anybody? Nobody at all? All right. Well, standard locks, you've got a few pins, average 4 to 6 pins, and you have to set those pins, and if you're like pretty good at it, you can kind of feel when the pin's set on the tumbler. So that takes, a couple of minutes, plus, you get a little bit of feel, maybe a little bit faster if you're really good at it. So what if we increase the number of pins? 4 to 6 doesn't take that long, but what if we increased it to 10 pins? What if we increased it 20, 50? You can imagine that would get pretty ridiculous to use, number one, because the key would become increasingly larger. And it would also be increasingly harder to pick because you'd have to set all of these bits. So what if we go up to 128 pins? Well, again, we have this gigantic imaginary key that you'd have to be some sort of a giant to hold and use. So let's reimagine our key as a couple of chessboards full of switches. So, unfortunately, with these, we lose the ability to feel when the pins get set. So, how long do you think it would take to figure out, with absolutely no feel and no information, the correct order of these switches that would open the magic treasure chest full of gold and jewels and bitcoins and everything else that you've ever wanted? A really long time. Really, really long time. So, what this generates is a set of combinations that is 2 to the 128th power. That is a comically large number. Specifically 3.4 times 10 to the 38th power. Comically large. So, one of my favorite cryptography statistics, Bruce Schneier, in his book Applied Cryptography, did a little bit of math on this. And using the best understanding of physics that we have on completely ideal circumstances, if you could capture every bit of energy that our sun puts out for 32 years, some gigantic Dyson sphere, and you were then able to channel all of that energy perfectly into some magic computer that could increment a counter with all of that energy you could increment a single counter 187-bit counter to its maximum value. That's a stupidly large amount of energy, a stupidly large amount of time. Number one, we're not going to channel the entire energy of our sun into a magic computer, and we're not going to use that computer to then try to crack cryptography. We're just not going to do it because it's silly. Another interesting number he created, if you could somehow do that in a giant Dyson sphere around a supernova, you could, again, use all of that energy to increment a 219-bit counter, and again, insanely large numbers. So even if you have those numbers, all you've done is actually increment through their values. You've not done any useful math with them whatsoever. You've literally just made them one bigger. So if we're applying this back to the treasure chest and opening keys and locks, if we want to apply energy to a problem, how much energy is it going to take to actually break this 128 option thing? For our purposes, pretty much infinity. It's close enough to be infinity that we'll call it infinity. It's extremely, extremely hard. So on a 128-bit security, 128 bits of security, you're pretty much guaranteed, again, other than weird side channel attacks and some other stuff like that, that key is going to outlive you. That no one is going to break it in your lifetime, your children's lifetimes, their children's lifetimes, down through your generations. If you go up to a 256-bit of entropy key, then, bits of security key, you're talking like heat death end of the universe amounts of energy that it would take to actually crack the thing. So how paranoid are you? Do you really need a 256-bit key? Maybe. I don't know. So, back on track a little bit. We have generated our key, so we're going to actually go outside of OpenSSH for a second. SSH Copy ID is one of the most useful utilities of all time. What it'll do is log into a server and put your public key into that user's authorized key file. Anybody who was playing CTF the other day, the authorized keys are a great way of getting between servers. But if you're using them without a password, it makes a serious, serious security hole that people can just hop between boxes for. So make sure when you do this that the key, the private key attached to that public key, has a strong password. It's really, really important. So if you, for some reason, do not have SSH Copy ID, that's actually really the set of steps that it does. It will copy using SSH the key it will SCP the file up to the server. It will then concatenate the key to the authorized key file and then remove the actual file that it uploaded. All right. So we've got all of these keys. We spent a huge amount of time on these keys. What can we actually do with it? So, slight detour again. Like I said, my really long 1,000-round iteration key takes me 7 seconds to use. And that's really, really annoying. And especially if you got that, you still have to type in a 20-character password, which is also really, really annoying if you're bouncing between boxes pretty quick. So, what we can do, and this is the first bit of magic I'd like to show you, we're going to use the SSH Agent. And I said earlier it's an in-memory key store, and that's pretty much true. What it does is maintains a copy of your unlocked private keys in memory to then allow SSH, SCP, and other SSH utilities to use that key. Specifically, it sets two environment variables, the SSH Agent ID and SSH auth sock, that the other utilities know how to use. The auth sock is actually a file. It's one of the Linux special files on the disk so it allows inter-process communication stuff. Pretty fancy. However, sometimes the SSH agent is not up by default. If you need to run the SSH agent, what it will do actually is fork itself into the background as soon as you run it, but with that, it's not allowed to set the environment variables in the current shell. So it has this nice option of -s, which will echo the born shell variables, or born shell commands that it needs to run, and eval we can do to actually run those commands, exporting the environment variables, and then specifically telling the user, hey, I've started up with this process ID. One more interesting option I want to point out is the -t, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later. That's a security option, and it says that we need to expire keys in 7 days. Again, according to your own personal paranoia level, security requirements and everything else, increase that up and down, but good default. And then SSH add -l will show you which keys are in the agent. However, if we have just started up the agent, we get this handy little message, the agent has no identities. That sounds familiar. Wait a minute. Okay, so let's actually add some IDs to our agent. Fairly simple, again, command line option, SSH add, and we're seeing this -t flag again. If we have no units specified, it's in seconds. And then we have to specifically tell it which one of the keys that we want to add into the agent. The -t option is actually extremely configurable. You don't have to give it numbers in seconds because that gets ridiculous. Give it in minutes. You can do some mixed case stuff like 1 day, 12 hours, which, equivalent to 36 hours and other equivalencies down the chain. But what that will do is prompt you for your private key password. And remember, extremely important, don't mistype that password because it will cost you that amount of time every single time you mistype it. So once it's loaded into the SSH agent, if for some reason you don't ever touch it again in 600 seconds, 10 minutes, whatever, then that key will be purged from memory. So really, really useful if you need to just load up an extremely secure key for a short amount of time to do single task type stuff. If you're looking at some less secure thing that you're just using a lot, increase the time span again, what your security requirements are, adjust up and down. Once it's actually in, like I said, you can delete it immediately using the lowercase d flag, or you can go nuclear and delete every key in the entire agent with the capital D. So one other nice little magic trick the SSH agent has is locking and unlocking. So let's say you've got one of these really super secure keys locked into memory. It has a 64-character password. It's got, forever, 1,000 million rounds, whatever. Well, let's say you have to step away from your box. You really want to have to wait 5 minutes for the key to unlock after typing 64-character password and hoping you didn't mistype that and everything else. Not really, that's a hassle. So what the SSH agent has is lock and unlock. When the agent is locked, it simply will not service any requests. Important security note. When it's locked, the keys are not re-encrypted. They are still in memory. They are still available in memory. So if someone has super user type access and can scrape memory, those keys are still there. But you can then unlock the agent with the capital X option. Whew. All right, let's actually talk about some configuration. There are a lot of very basic options we're going to go through first. And then we're going to go into a little bit more of like crazy cryptography again. All right, Protocol 2. So if you remember back into our history lesson, in 1996, they said, hey, this old version's broken. We should probably stop using it. So what we're going to do is say, we will only accept the second protocol. We don't want to use the first one. It's been broken since before the millennium. Don't do it. Permit root login. So when you have a server, you don't want someone coming in as a super user. Almost never. It's a very bad idea. You don't want users doing it. You really don't want attackers doing it. So just straight up disable it. Let users have standard privilege escalation through other mechanisms. Don't let them come in as the super user. Let's see. There is actually, I will make a caveat to that. There is one special exception where this is okay. Instead of the configuration option of no, there is forced commands only. You can set up individual keys to have access to a root account. So let's say you need to run a backup of some sort, and you know that you have to have root permissions to run this backup. It needs to run with super level access across. You can set up a key to then log into the box, and when that key logs into the box, the only thing it's allowed to do, and literally nothing else happens, is that command gets run. So you can set up, backup.sh to that private key or that public key, and when that public key gets in, then you have a backup kicked off. In general, unless you have an extremely, extremely good reason to do that sort of thing, just don't allow root login. It's a very, very bad idea. We want to enable public key authentication because that's a really, really good idea. Instead of having passwords, which, again, can be brute forced eventually, if we use the public key, it takes a near infinity amount to brute force these public keys. So let's use those because it's really, really secure. One second. A lot of stuff on this slide. Okay. And then obviously next, once we have public key authentication enabled, we want to disable password authentication. There's no reason once you have keys set up that you need to be logging into these servers with passwords. You need to make extremely, extremely sure that the keys are set up before you actually do this, because you can and will lock yourself out of the box. And by you, I mean me, because I've done that multiple times. It's important. Don't do it. Learn from my mistakes. Host-based authentication. No. You can, by default, trust entire hosts, trust users coming from those hosts. If you've got extremely, extremely good control over all of that, then maybe there's a case for it. But in general, public key authentication is what you want to use for SSH. Login grace time. By default, this is actually 120 seconds. And what it will do is sit there and hold open a connection while a user is trying to log in. If a user hasn't logged in 120 seconds, it just automatically closes the connection. So this is a little bit of a kind of personal preference, but there's really no reason to hold open the connection that long for things that you know to be trustworthy. This also kind of leaves you open to a little bit of DDoS stuff, and you just don't want that. Max auth tries. The configuration option of 3. The default is actually 6 in OpenSSH. What this does is limit the number of times a user can attempt a login per connection attempt. So you SSH to host, and then you type your password in, and you see it fail. Well, okay, you try it again, and okay, it fails again. Third time fails, it'll actually disconnect you. So since we are not going to use passwords, we are going to reduce this dramatically from 6 to 3. The agent can actually be configured to, the hosts can be configured to, one more time, sorry. The clients can be configured to specifically tell each individual host which key it wants to use. However, if I know anything about users, we get lazy about configuration. So what we'll do is we will just load up a couple of keys into the agent, and the agent does its best. It tries everything it can to think of, and what that means is guessing which key to use. So 3 allows users like me to be a little bit lazy with configuration, but still be able to get in with the public keys. So the other interesting thing about the max auth tries is that it has a follow-on effect of any attempt over half of that value gets logged if it fails. So essentially, for that, a user gets one try that is free, all right, whatever. But on the second and third ones, because they are over half of the 1.5, 2 to 3, it gets logged and says, hey, someone's doing something they probably shouldn't be doing over here. Max sessions. So SSH by default forks off child processes. SSHD forks off child processes to handle the individual connections. Actually, we were in Capture the Flag yesterday hitting this quite a bit because our friend over there was brute forcing all of the passwords. So in the middle of this, we were running out of SSH connections. I believe the default for this value is 10, but on systems that there are going to be much smaller users, give yourself a little bit of leeway to not get locked out, but 5 is still a pretty comfortable margin of error. All right, what you can actually do is specify host keys. When the computer first creates, or when the SSHD first creates a login, it will generate keys for the host. And one of the nice things about SSH is that it specifically says, this is the key I identify myself with. So you can find out if someone has hijacked in the middle of your connection. You try to connect and it says, hey, this key is, this host is presenting with this key, do you trust it? And you always get the yes or no prompt. Sometimes you say yes, sometimes you say no. You always say yes. But theoretically, if you have a well-controlled host base, you can specifically list out all of your host's public keys, so you can then say, oh, this key actually matches that host, I actually trust it. And those will go into your known hosts file in your individual user accounts. Not talking about that right now, but what we can do is actually generate much stronger host keys. By default, it uses some kind of silly options. So we will go ahead and generate a brand new one for the hosts that we're on if we would like to. However, the important thing is that the host keys have to not have passwords. So SSHD needs to have the private key to be able to then use the public key as well for both sides of that. So if you want to generate the elliptic curve key, that command. If you would like to generate an RSA key for the host, that command. Again, if you don't have a bunch of old clients, don't enable the RSA. Allow groups. There are a couple of different options around this. There's allow groups, allow users. I think there's actually an allow hosts as well. What you can do is specifically lock down which users are allowed to connect in. It goes back to our user authentication piece. Groups is a lot more flexible. Instead of having to restart the SSH daemon every time that you want to change which users are allowed into your system, what you can do is allow a group of users, and then all of the users in that group, you can add whatever at any time, and SSH says, oh, okay, this person's okay to come into my server. Okay, that was a lot, but those are a lot of the very basic stuff. Now we're going to talk about a little bit of crazy cryptography again. Follow with me. I apologize. It'll be over soon. The key exchange algorithms. There are quite a few of these. The SSH protocol itself has a list of available options for this. However, the IETF realized that eventually we would need more of them. So what we have is the ability to define brand new ones using the syntax you see here that says @ and then an identifying URL. So specifically what we want to enable is curve 25519. And what this is an elliptic curve version of the Diffie-Hellman algorithm. So let's see. If you have an extremely recent set of clients, this will work out for you just fine. However, if you are having a bunch of old clients that just straight up can't update for whatever reason, you can enable also the Diffie-Hellman group exchange, and that uses the standard set of Diffie-Hellman algorithms. Now, if you enable the Diffie-Hellman specifically, without the elliptic curve, you need to go one step further. There is a set of I just lost the word. A set of prime numbers, a prime number group inside of this file here, etc SSH moduli. And by default, a lot of these are pretty low strength. You have 1024-bit prime numbers, you have 2048-bit prime numbers. So, and actually for some compatibility, there's even less than 1024. You don't want to use extremely small prime numbers because, again, we have enough processing power to actually break some of those. What we're going to do is actually generate our own. Going back to our friend SSH Key Gen, we will generate a set of possible prime numbers that might be prime numbers. And we're going to specifically tell it to use only 4096 bits for the prime numbers. This doesn't take that long, but it's not also very quick. About half hour usually, give or take. And it'll generate, again, a pretty long list of options. However, not all of the options that it generates are actually prime numbers. So that's where we're going to go to our friend SSH Key Gen again and say, hey, now that we have all these options, will you test them and make sure that we're actually using prime numbers, because it's really, really important. So when you get up to prime numbers in this large of a bit range, it's extremely hard and extremely time consuming to actually fully test for the thing being entirely a prime number. However, there is an algorithm which lets us get extremely high probability. I should have written down that algorithm name, but the SSH Key Gen implements it, and it will run each number through this algorithm 100 times based on a set of, it starts at some random number, and then based on the output of that, checks it again and again and again. And after 100 rounds, you have 99.5 or 69% probability that this number is actually a prime number. So it's very, very good as a limit test. You obviously don't want to go through and test every single number up to that number divisible, because it'll take forever. Okay. So yeah, it'll output to the moduli.all there with the -f option. And what you'll want to do then is move the safe options that you found into the actual moduli file. So this, again, it comes with every distro you find. It's set up by default, which also makes the numbers in there extremely valuable targets, because if you actually can crack one of them, everyone using them you can spy on. So generate your own. This will take time. It's a lengthy process. You're doing a huge amount of math. I don't actually have a benchmark number for you, but it will take you not very... It won't take days, but it won't be quick. So kind of in the middle, let it run off to the background. If you want, generate a bunch of these beforehand, and then just copy them over the new servers as you get them. Okay, so key exchange algorithms, that specifically is the negotiation for the shared secret that we're going to use to further communicate back and forth. Okay, once we have the shared secret, what we want to use is an actual symmetric cipher. We will plug in the shared secret to this. There are a few pretty good options. The Cha-Cha 20 is based on Salsa 20, and it is using a Poly 1305 hash algorithm. It's extremely secure and uses elliptic curve cryptography again, so that's what we would like to use as a symmetric cipher. If you need to have older clients again, we still want to use extremely high bits for the actual ciphers. Again, 128 if you're slightly less paranoid, but again, processing power is only going to get more plentiful and cheaper, so if you have the option, go ahead and use the strongest stuff you can get a hold of. So those three in that order. MACs, Message Authentication Codes. So this is the validation step. Each time that you have this encrypted set of bits, you want to say, here's a hash basically of what bits that I'm sending you and attach that to the message. There are a bunch of algorithms for this, and a lot of them use pretty high number of bits, as you can see there. ETM is specifically encrypt then MAC. So what you're doing is taking the hash of the encrypted set of information instead of the base information unencrypted. Theoretically, it'd be really, really hard to brute force the actual contents from that MAC if it's not encrypted first. But if you were able to, or specifically doing the MAC against the encryption, all they would get back from brute forcing that hash would be the encrypted set of bits. So again, pretty much useless to them. Okay, so that was a lot of stuff. That was the actual server configuration itself. It lives in /etc/ssh/sshd_config. So there are ways to configure the clients as well. And pretty much everything I just said there that is not explicitly for a server, number of login attempts and stuff like that, that stuff can also be configured on the client side. So you can make the client itself more secure. Again, if you are connecting to a more permissibly configured SSH server, you can still have the client choose to use the strongest stuff, again, assuming that the server supports it. It has a cascading permission set, which is really nice. There's a system level that is living in etc SSH SSH config. After that, there are options that you can set in the users.ssh folder in the config file. And finally, when you actually run SSH, you can get command line options to alter and change around pretty much any of that stuff on the fly. The server configurations take effect unless the user's configuration changes it, and the user's configuration takes effect unless the command line changes it. Pretty much standard cascading permissions. The really nice thing about the clients is that you can specify different options per host. OpenSSH specifically has a really nice feature, or possibly not nice feature depending on how you look at it. The very first value that matches is what gets set, and it will not get overridden in this cascading permission set. So you don't want to completely lock down everything from the system level of SSH config. You want to allow some configuration options there. Okay, so we've gone through a whole lot of configuration. Now we want to automate it, because that was a lot. So we're going to talk a little bit about Ansible. Ansible is an automation framework that runs over SSH. It's Python-based, written by a fellow by the name of Michael Tahan. Ansible, the name itself, comes from an old book called Rakannen's World in 1966. It was also in Ender's Game and a bunch of other pretty famous sci-fi stuff. Ansible itself, again, uses SSH and is configured in YAML, the yet another markup language. The really nice advantage to using YAML and Python together is the actual syntax is very, very similar, down to even the spacing being important. Okay, so the Ansible hosts file. To actually tell Ansible what servers to operate on, they have a host file. You can set it up in standard INI format where you have a group name and then a set of options. It has a very flexible syntax. You can use patterns, you can use ranges, you can do all sorts of fancy stuff, but you can configure a static hosts file. Luckily, you do not have to use a static hosts file. If you have gigantic enterprise sets of servers, everything else, there are a number of very common inventory plugins you can use with Ansible. Amazon actually released one for EC2, so you can give it your authentication information and run ec2.py, and it will generate this file against your current configuration out on AWS. There are plugins for LDAP, Active Directory, all sorts of different things. Or again, static if you need that. So yeah. Okay, so this is really the entire code for it. First, we use a specific keyword called hosts, and that tells this particular playbook which ones to actually set up. Well, if we're configuring our security, let's run it against all the things. One other important thing, YAML, there are 3 dashes at the top there. That is the start of a YAML file. So it doesn't, it's not a mistake. It's actually supposed to be there. Become is it basically tells the playbook to use super level access. By default, what that will use is sudo. When you get into the box, whatever user you've authenticated as runs that. There's other options you can configure to change that to other methods, but this works just fine. So, tasks. Inside of the playbook, we need to basically do 2 things. What we want to do is copy our nice SSH config file that we've set up, now that it has all the nice secured permissions, out onto the server. So, we tell the copy module to get the source of local directory resources, SSH deconfig, and put it in the destination there, on whatever server that we're operating on. Ansible will operate iteratively over the hosts, and there's configuration options for like X number at a time and some other fancy stuff, but this will do it on each one of the servers. The last option there, validate, is extremely important too. So we are managing SSH over SSH. What we don't want to do is lock ourselves out. That's a terrible time. Again, learn from my mistakes. So what we can do when we copy a file is have a utility on the host itself validate that information. And specifically, the SSH daemon has a -t flag that you can give it that will have it validate the current configuration. That information and all of the return values from this particular execution of copy, we register into copy_result. So what we want to do then, once we've got the actual configuration out there, is tell SSH, the SSH daemon, to start using it. However, like I said, we want to make sure that the file we put out there is valid and is not going to just lock us out of the box. So we use this magic here when copyResult.checksum, when the copy places the file out there, it will take a SHA-1 sum of that file and put it into the variable checksum. So since we know exactly what the checksum should be on our side, because it's a static file on our side, we take that checksum, we say, there it is in there, test that against what the checksum is from the server. If they match, then we need to tell the SSH daemon to reread the configuration file. Luckily, there is a nice convenient way of doing that without actually fully restarting it and killing everything. If you send the SSH daemon the hup signal, then it will reread the configuration and do the standard forking stuff around to have new connections start using that configuration. Also, I highly recommend you have logged in to this box with, at least until you're sure that this works, with some user with like sudo access or some other root permissions, because you will invariably mess it up once or twice, and then you'll have to completely reimage the box, and it's a terrible, terrible time. Okay, so pretty short, no big deal. To actually run this, real simple again. We run the command ansible-playbook on the setup.ssh.yaml file that we created, and we give it the -k option, which tells it to prompt for the administrator level access. Anytime we use the sudo, we don't want to hard code that password into the file because, again, terrible, terrible security. So, hey, ask me when you start running a thing, and I'll give it to you. Whew. All right. Lot of resources. Specifically, a lot of the cryptography and stuff came from this top site. It's actually what gave me the inspiration for the talk many, many moons ago. The guy looked at the NSA leaks and said, hey, the NSA is spying on everything. We probably should be a little more secure, and went back through and configured the SSH to pretty similar to what I have. I've actually done a little bit more restrictive stuff than he did, but there's that. The actual snail book, the SSH Definitive Guide, read through that. It's also incredibly informative. There are an enormous amount of configuration options you can give to SSH, even past what I've put up here. Same thing with a client, just a wealth of good information in that. The crypto is a little outdated because I believe the second edition was published in 2006, but the actual options haven't changed that much. I'll put that somewhere. I'm not entirely sure where. I'll get with Adrian and have him publish it up there. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Any questions? All right. Thank you. Two special acknowledgements. First, thank you to my wife because she put up with me while I was doing all of that. I get a little insufferable when I'm geeking out about technology, and I've been doing that for weeks now. So thank you for that. And also the pretty stuff from this, that was my wife's doing, so no credit for that. Second, thanks to my company.